Hello students, teachers, parents, history nerds. Hello everybody, and welcome to Nutshelled History, where we lay out the facts, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Today, we are going to continue our United States history series by looking at civil rights and reform in the 1960s. Don't forget that there's a link for a fill-in-the-blanks worksheet in the description. I just ask that you like and subscribe. I apologize for any mispronunciations ahead of time. I do my best. Okay, let's go. The Declaration of Independence famously states that all men are created equal. Yet we know that all men, or people, as we would say today, are not really equal. Some people are smarter than other people, some are taller or more athletic. So what did the founders mean by equal? What does the term equality really mean in a world where people are clearly different? And how can we ensure equality for all? In the 1950s and 60s, African Americans escalated their efforts to achieve a more equal status in American society. The civil rights movement strengthens after World War II. Even though the battlefields had cooled off, things were still heating up in the South, where Jim Crow laws kept a firm grip on segregation. This de jure segregation, or by-the-book separation, meant that black and white folks had to stay on their designated sides of pretty much everything. But up north, even without official laws, de facto segregation, or segregation by tradition, meant that the lines were just as clear, even if they weren't written down. Enter Thurgood Marshall, a lawyer with a mission to challenge these divides. By 1954, he and his team took segregation in public schools head-on with Brown v. Board of Education. The Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, declared that separate schools were anything but equal, and with a historic ruling gave Jim Crow a serious side-eye. But the South wasn't ready to back down just yet. In Little Rock, Arkansas, the governor ordered the National Guard to stop 9 black students from entering the local high school. President Eisenhower, no fan of insubordination, sent in federal troops to ensure these students could safely enter. And yet, many southern states continued to put up a fight. In 1957, Congress made a modest but meaningful move with the Civil Rights Act, establishing the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. It was small progress but a symbolic win, the first such bill since Reconstruction, signaling Congress was finally dusting off the playbook for civil rights. Then, in 1955, came a moment that changed everything. Rosa Parks, a black woman in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to surrender her bus seat to a white passenger. Her arrest sparked a one-day bus boycott, and soon, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was stepping up to the microphone. In an impassioned speech, he urged African Americans to use nonviolence as a path to justice. The boycott didn't just end after a day, it went on for over a year, with African Americans standing together in solidarity. In 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that segregated buses were unconstitutional, proving that peaceful protest could indeed make change. And just like that, Dr. King and his message of nonviolence became the heart and soul of the civil rights movement, paving the way for the battles ahead. The movement surges forward. Even with a few wins under their belt, civil rights activists weren't ready to hang up their protest signs just yet. Down in North Carolina, 4 college students decided to give a new meaning to the phrase, "taking a seat." They staged a sit-in at a local lunch counter to protest discrimination, and let's just say they weren't ordering takeout. This brave move sparked similar protests all across the country, leading to the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. These young activists were ready to make some noise, peacefully of course. The next big showdown was on wheels, interstate buses. The Supreme Court had already ruled that segregation on these buses was a no-go, but it seemed like not everyone got the memo. So in 1961, the Congress of Racial Equality organized a freedom ride through the Deep South to test if the federal government was serious about enforcing the law. Spoiler alert, violence broke out. But this got President Kennedy's attention, and Mississippi's leaders finally agreed to offer some police protection. Better late than never, right? Then came James Meredith, a man on a mission to enroll at the all-white University of Mississippi. With the help of civil rights hero Medgar Evers, Meredith won a federal court case allowing him to attend. Of course, this victory didn't go over well with everyone. Full-scale riots erupted, but Meredith stayed strong and eventually graduated in 1963. Take that, segregation. Meanwhile, in Birmingham, Alabama, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, were gearing up for a major campaign. They kicked things off with peaceful protests and sit-ins, but Birmingham's Public Safety Commissioner wasn't exactly feeling the love. He unleashed police dogs and fire hoses on the protesters, creating shocking news footage that left many Americans asking, "What's going on down there?" To keep the momentum going, civil rights supporters organized the massive March on Washington in August 1963, where over 200,000 people gathered. King stole the show with his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech, leaving everyone with chills and a newfound sense of hope. Just a few months later, tragedy struck when President Kennedy was assassinated. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson stepped in and, using every political trick in the book, got the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. This landmark law banned segregation in public spaces, signaling a huge shift in race relations and setting the stage for more victories. The civil rights movement had leveled up, and it wasn't done yet. Successes and setbacks. The civil rights movement had made some big strides, but down south, voting rights for African Americans were still stuck in quicksand. In 1964, the SNCC decided it was time to shake things up with a little project called Freedom Summer. They sent about 1,000 volunteers into Mississippi because, nothing says easy task like convincing Mississippi in the 60s to let African Americans register to vote. Meanwhile, in Selma, Alabama, Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC were gearing up for a voting rights showdown. The peaceful protesters marched, but heavily armed state troopers responded with force, making it clear they weren't there for a friendly escort. The whole thing was so outrageous that even Congress couldn't ignore it. And in 1965, they passed the Voting Rights Act, finally kicking out those pesky literacy tests. The 24th Amendment had already gotten rid of the poll tax in 1964, so the barriers were starting to crumble, at least on paper. Yet for many African Americans, especially in cities, the progress felt like it was stuck in neutral. Frustration over discrimination and poverty boiled over, leading to race riots across the country. President Johnson scratched his head and formed the Kerner Commission to figure out what was going on. Their answer? Long-term racial discrimination was the biggest culprit. Who would have guessed? The frustration also sparked a new sense of militancy among young African Americans. Enter Malcolm X, the outspoken minister of the Nation of Islam, who wasn't exactly preaching "turn the other cheek." Instead, he was all about racial separation and black pride. His views were so bold, he became a legend, and when he was assassinated in 1965, he left behind a following of young activists who were tired of waiting for change. Taking Malcolm X's message to heart, SNCC leader Stokely Carmichael started calling for black power, urging African Americans to flex their political and economic muscles. Soon, the Black Panther Party was born, becoming an icon of young, assertive black pride almost overnight. Then came a tragic blow. On April 4, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. In the wake of his death, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, which banned discrimination in housing. But despite the gains made, the rising militancy and heartbreak of the era left a bittersweet legacy. The civil rights movement had come a long way, but it was clear there were still miles to go. Kennedy's reforms. The 1960 presidential election was a battle of the young guns. Democrat John F. Kennedy versus Republican Richard M. Nixon. Both were sharp, energetic, and could rock a suit like nobody's business. Kennedy ended up squeaking out a victory, thanks in no small part to his cool, calm, and collected performance in the first ever televised debate, while Nixon looked like he'd just sprinted in from a rainstorm. Once in office, Kennedy promised Americans a new frontier, which sounded exciting, like maybe it involved exploring Mars or something. But really, it was a plan to tackle the economy, education, healthcare, and civil rights. Kennedy had charm for days, and with a dream team of advisors, he set out to win over Congress and the American public. Kennedy was bothered by the high poverty levels in the country and wanted to make a difference. Congress wasn't exactly lining up to make big changes, but he managed to boost the minimum wage and give a little TLC to the welfare system. He even tried to get equal pay for women through the Equal Pay Act, though with a few loopholes that would keep lawyers busy for years. Still, it was a decent step toward workplace fairness. When he took office, the economy was in rough shape. Kennedy decided to go with the spend now, pay later plan, based on John Maynard Keynes' idea that a little deficit spending could jumpstart things. Think of it as giving the economy a little caffeine jolt, except with a lot more zeros on the price tag. At first, Kennedy was cautious on civil rights, worried about losing the support of conservative Democrats. But by 1963, he knew it was time to take a stand. He introduced a civil rights bill aimed at helping with school desegregation and protecting African American rights. Because as it turned out, justice couldn't wait for political convenience. Kennedy's new frontier even looked to the stars. America was nervous about losing the space race to the Soviets, so Kennedy boldly declared that we'd land a man on the moon before the decade was out. People were like, wait, seriously? But sure enough, in 1969, we were planting the American flag on the lunar surface. Talk about shooting for the stars. Tragically, Kennedy's term was cut short. In 1963, he was assassinated while riding in a motorcade in Dallas, Texas. Lee Harvey Oswald was named as the lone gunman, though theories still swirl about whether he acted alone. The Warren Commission officially declared it a solo act, but that didn't stop a whole cottage industry of conspiracy theories from springing up. Kennedy's death left the nation in mourning, as Americans felt that some of the nation's hope and innocence had died with him. Reform under Johnson. Lyndon B. Johnson didn't exactly stroll into the presidency. Taking over after Kennedy's assassination, Johnson had big shoes to fill and a great society to build. Born in a tiny Texas town, Johnson wasn't handed any silver spoons. After college, he taught at a poor, segregated school for Mexican-American kids, an experience that likely fueled his fire for change. From there, he hustled his way into Congress and started climbing the political ladder with all the determination of a Texan chasing down a runaway steer. LBJ was a natural politician, known for his, let's say, persuasive style. One of his first big wins as president was pushing through the Civil Rights Act, which Kennedy had introduced. This wasn't just any bill, it was a major step toward tackling discrimination in voting, education, and public spaces. Johnson didn't just pass it, he wrestled it through Congress, likely with his famous Johnson treatment, which basically involved towering over people and refusing to let them say no. Johnson was also ready to take on poverty. Declaring a war on poverty, he aimed to provide education, training, and healthcare to those who needed it most. The Economic Opportunity Act kicked off this effort, bringing us programs like Job Corps, Vista, and Head Start. Because, hey, everyone deserves a head start. After winning the presidency in 1964, Johnson laid out his grand vision for the country, calling it the Great Society. His goal? Nothing less than an end to poverty and racial injustice. Congress got on board, and by 1965, the Great Society was taking shape. Johnson wasn't done yet. He also took a swing at healthcare with Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare provided basic hospital insurance for older Americans, while Medicaid stepped in to help those who were poor or disabled. Because Johnson figured everyone could use a little help with their doctor bills. Education and immigration got the Great Society treatment too. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1965 poured resources into schools in poorer communities, and the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 opened the doors to millions of new Americans. Thanks to Johnson, the land of opportunity was living up to its name. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren was on its own reform spree. Known as the Warren Court, it tackled some of the thorniest issues of the day, from civil rights to personal privacy, and wasn't shy about making bold decisions. You could almost say they were on their own Great Society mission from the bench. All right, let's do our recap. The civil rights movement surged forward in the 1950s and 60s as African Americans sought true equality, challenging the stark segregation in both the South's by-the-book Jim Crow laws and the North's by-tradition discrimination. Figures like Thurgood Marshall and Martin Luther King Jr. led efforts to dismantle segregation, from landmark rulings like Brown v. Board of Education to public protests like the Montgomery bus boycott and the March on Washington. Meanwhile, Presidents Kennedy and Johnson pushed for reform, with Kennedy advocating his new frontier for civil rights, poverty reduction, and space exploration, and Johnson implementing his Great Society, which focused on health care, Medicare, Medicaid, education, and voting rights with acts like the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The movement's peaceful protests, punctuated by dramatic standoffs and tragic violence, brought powerful legal victories, but also revealed ongoing racial injustices that continued to spark frustration, militancy, and calls for Black power. With the Fair Housing Act passed after King's assassination, the movement left a bittersweet legacy, with gains made, but much work left for future generations. There you have it, folks. That is civil rights and reform in the 1960s nutshelled. Thanks for stopping by Nutshelled History. Don't forget to knock on those like and subscribe buttons for me. It really helps me out. See y'all next time on Nutshelled History.